and it's part of a regular series of book panels that we've had at past conferences, evaluating significant books in Utah history. Normally we evaluate monographs. This, of course, is not a monograph. It's a diary, which in some ways makes it even more accessible, but perhaps more difficult to evaluate, because how do you evaluate all the dozens of themes and the hundreds of individuals that sort of weave in and out of this diary in some sort of a coherent whole, right? So we'll do our best to pick this apart, at least in ways that we individually see it, and to sort of provide a critical review. That is to say, to give it the attention that I think it deserves. Certainly commanded the attention for 3 months of Gary Topping's life, and he blames me for that, because you can see that this is a very, very thick set of diaries. But I say blame Gary Bergera, or at least blame Leonard Arrington for being such a writer. So I'm going to offer specific comments in a moment, but for now I'll introduce the panelists and then turn it over to them for their formal comments. I'll provide a few observations of my own, and then we'll have kind of a conversation among us, and then turn it over to audience participation. So to my right is Gary James Bergera, currently managing director of the Smith-Pettit Foundation, and he is, of course, among many other works, the editor of Confessions of a Mormon Historian. John Sillito is to his right, is formerly archivist, curator of special collections, and professor of libraries at Weber State University. Cristina Rosett is a doctoral candidate of religious studies at the University of California, Riverside. And then finally, Gary Topping is formerly curator of manuscripts at the Utah State Historical Society and professor of history at Salt Lake Community College. He's presently archivist of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Salt Lake City. So if we may, let's go in that order. If you don't mind coming up to the podium and take it from there. So Gary.
So I have some written comments. I'm always more comfortable with with a prepared text at the beginning. First, I'd like to say how honored I am to share this afternoon's discussion with these panelists. They are all people of impeccable scholarship and good conscience who, I'm certain, would never say a negative or critical word about anyone or his or her work, and in fact would only say very positive, uplifting things. Jed Rogers, in an email to us, indicated that he would like us in our brief introductory comments to take note of the Arrington Diaries, and presumably the publication of the Diaries, as occurring within the larger context of diary keeping and what they, that is the diaries, reveal about the process of doing history. By doing, which Jed placed in quotation marks, I interpret as both constructing and reconstructing history. Before offering my own observations, let me quote Lavina Fielding Anderson, who wrote one of the very first studies of Arrington as LDS church historian. At this year's Sunstone Theological Symposium, Anderson offered some context as to Arrington's place among other diarists. Quote, I've tried to think of comparable diaries, Anderson said. 19th century LDS Church President Wilford Woodruff was resolutely an official historian to the degree that he minimized references to his family and his profession, while assiduously recording sermons, meetings, and even gossip that involved Joseph Smith and, over a longer span of years, Brigham Young. But except for the years he was living in Salt Lake City as church historian, he seems to have been on the fringes of the Quorum of the 12 in the First Presidency's activities. The same description applies, in my opinion, to LDS First Presidency Counselor George Q. Cannon's diaries, now available online. Although I have certainly not plumbed their depths, I prefer the diaries of George's son and LDS Apostle Abram H. Cannon, partly because they are decidedly more personal and present a better rounded image of his life. Emmeline B. Wells kept a fascinating and strongly revelatory diary, one that invites psychological analysis, but which separates her personal and her professional life. Helen Mar Kimball Whitney's diary, kept during the closing years of her life, records personal lamentations and fears. And Leonard Arrington's diaries resemble hers in one respect, I believe, in that they were both interested and keen observers, from the margins of the power figures in Mormon history and governance. The fact remains, however, that until and unless the personal diaries of current LDS general authorities become available, Leonard's diary may be the closest record we have access to of what was going on in downtown Salt Lake City during the 1970s and 1980s especially, end quote. While employed at both Signature Books and at the Smith-Pettit Foundation, I helped, more or less, to bring to publication some 15-plus diaries. What I personally have learned from this exposure I summarize as follows. Diaries vary significantly in utility. Some are essentially brief, sometimes annotated appointment calendars. Others function as self-aware personal narratives. Some, perhaps the majority, are primarily of interest to the family members of the diarist, readers who experience a special relationship to the diarist that other non-family members don't. Other diaries, a minority, are maintained by individuals who are aware on some level that they are doing or creating history, who understand that they are writing for a posterity beyond immediate family members, who appreciate that their creations will be read and consulted by non-family members and possibly by historians, and thus who are consciously aware of the historical political value of their creation. Diaries are subjective. They present their creators' perspectives and are not unbiased. They must be used with due caution and with an appreciation for their compromised nature. That said, they remain, especially when created contemporaneously with the events they narrate, one of the most important sources of historical recreation available, especially when used in conjunction with the contemporary diaries, etc., of other participants in the events being narrated. This, I believe, is one of the drawbacks to the Arrington Diaries. The contemporary records of the various LDS Church General Authorities mentioned in the Arrington Diaries are restricted and hence unavailable for consultation. And the diaries of Arrington's contemporaries are either similarly restricted, albeit for a specific length of time, as David's Bitten's are at BYU for 30 years, I believe, or are held privately, either by the individuals themselves or by their families. At some future point, 50 or 60 or more years from now, perhaps it may be possible to create a fuller account of Arrington's years as LDS Church historian. But for the present, as Levina Fielding Anderson notes, we have only Arrington. In terms of Arrington's own diary, I left a 6-year project of helping to prepare them for publication with the following takeaways. First, the writing of history depends on primary sources. Arrington knew and appreciated that any attempt at recreating the intellectual history of the LDS Church during the last third of the 20th century needs access to first-person narratives. Thus, he not only produced one of the seminal documents needed for such a history, he guaranteed its prominence by making certain that it would be accessible to researchers and readers by placing it in a public repository. Second, the obstacles Arrington and his colleagues in the History Division of the LDS Church Historical Department faced in attempting to fulfill their callings to produce good scholarly history during the 1970s were more numerous and greater than, I believe, many people today assume was the case. It is sometimes asserted that Arrington failed to cultivate sufficiently good relations with his ecclesiastical superiors, or was naive in failing to understand the complex operations of the church's bureaucracy. In fact, Arrington was aggressively prevented from pursuing his assignment from the First Presidency by high-ranking church leaders who refused to support Arrington's appointment and by certain church bureaucrats who spied on Arrington and misrepresented the work of the History Division. Ironically, the foundation Arrington and his colleagues laid 40 years ago has today made possible the many important contributions in scholarship of the Joseph Smith Papers Project and the LDS Church Historians Press. Third, and on a more personal note, the possession of a great intellect does not guarantee that one will never make mistakes. For all of Arrington's genius, he was not above making misjudgments and missteps. He underestimated the toll his workaholism took on his wife, Grace. He misjudged the ability of colleagues to process developments regarding the deterioration of the History Division at the hands of church bureaucrats. He could be overly optimistic, and he sometimes made important personal decisions more on the basis of emotions than on reasoned thinking. As Arrington himself liked to say of other historical figures, we may not agree with every decision he took, but we are warmed by his humanity. As I contemplate the diaries, I have come to believe that the careful reading of them will bring the reader as close to knowing another person as is possible. I have also come to believe that every reader's experience with Arrington and his diaries will be different. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel. I knew Leonard. I worked with him at the Church Historical Department from 1974 to 1977, though in fairness, I was at a much lower pay grade than Leonard was. I thought of him as my colleague and my friend then and after that. I'm going to resist telling Leonard stories, okay? We all have a bunch of them, and I'm going to resist on doing that. What I am going to do is try to build a little bit on what Gary said. These diaries, in my opinion, constitute an important addition to our knowledge of Leonard Arrington, certainly, but beyond that, to Utah history, Mormon history, and the nature of the church bureaucracy itself. They are, so far as I can see, unique documents. With due respect to what Levina had to say and what Gary had to say, there are others to come. But at this point, I can't think of anything in Mormon history, or perhaps even broader fields, that is quite like what Leonard and through Gary has been achieved. There are autobiographies of Leonard himself, and others are autobiographies, and even some writings of Andrew Jensen, but there's nothing that I'm aware of that's quite the same. Now, I'm subject to correction on that point, and I look forward to it if I need it. Great credit for this project goes to Gary, obviously, but it goes to the other contributors in the project as well. Susan Madsen, Joe Geisner, Levina Fielding Anderson, Jeff Johnson, Tom Alexander, and particularly, in my view, Becky Bartholomew. In the limited time I have, I'd like to make 3 points. First, Leonard was writing to document his own life story, and there is considerable Arrington Fort family history therein, but also to record his place in the larger narrative. Simultaneously with that task, he was creating a broader primary source. Now, that broader primary source needs to be judged like any other primary source is judged. Leonard provides important insights on a number of topics, particularly interesting to me as someone who worked down there: his selection as church historian, the choosing of his assistants and his staff in the history division, the complicated question of the publications by the members of the staff, some of the other views of people within the larger historical department, his own view of his dismissal, and the role that G. Homer Durham played in all of this. That relationship between Durham and Arrington started friendly, but it certainly did not end that way. I enjoyed his careful recording of his version of what happened during the time he was church historian. One of the most interesting entries to me comes on September 4th, 1981, where he writes and gives a compelling assessment of that period of time. He admits to having a certain sense of failure, but he also says he has a sense of pride at what he and his colleagues accomplished. Looking back on it, that seems to be pretty much on the mark to me. Others will have different interpretation of these people and events. Leonard knew that, and he would appreciate and encourage the discussion and debate that's going on today, and as other documents are made available. It's clear to me, it's clear that he assumed these materials would be open someday, and more likely sooner rather than later. We're glad they are. Second, one of the things that I took away from those diaries is Leonard sought to capture information he felt that might not be captured in any other way. At times he records the views of individuals that he encountered. Let me give you one that I found sort of interesting. On December 9th, 1971, he says that he had spoken with Whitney Smith, who was the grandson of Orson F. Whitney. And Whitney Smith was talking about Heber J. Grant's process of revelation. He said Grant told him that he thought the welfare plan was revelation, but that he didn't have revelation all the time. Although, he said, I was going to call Richard W. Young to be an apostle. And then I thought about it and prayed about it, and I ultimately called Melvin J. Ballard. That's a nice, interesting fact for us to think about, both in terms of Grant, revelation, and the calling of general authority. On other occasions in the diaries, he provides summaries of people and events based on his own observation and research. Again, I think with the idea that these will provide additional information for future scholars. One of the most interesting is his assessment of David O. Mckay. There's a long discourse in the diaries about Mckay that I think very honestly assesses Mckay's strengths, his faults, and his place in church history. He concludes this assessment by saying, according to Leonard, no person with the exception of Joseph Smith contributed more than Mckay. That's an interesting assertion that perhaps future scholarship will continue to deal with. But he wanted his view of that subject to be on the record for that discussion. Another thing that I found in the diaries that I sort of knew, but I found them in a slightly different way. He loved gossip. He really did. He had a wide networks of friends and associates and simply people he met whose viewpoint he wanted to record. And he enjoyed a good story. There are things in the diary that would mean nothing to anybody but me, but he knew exactly what was happening in terms of selecting a president at Weber State back in the period of time that ultimately brought us Joseph L. Bishop. Maybe you've heard the name. He was picking up things from people all the time. This is one of the stories that I found most interesting. He says on one occasion he met with Franklin Murdoch, who told him a story about J. Golden Kimball and Emmeline B. Wells. According to Arrington, according to Murdoch, Emmeline, who was very ill, had asked on repeated days for the members of the First Presidency to bless her. They did so, but after a few days they tired of the assignment on a daily basis, and they asked J. Golden Kimball to represent them. When Emmeline, who was then living in the Hotel Utah, according to Murdoch, saw Kimball at her door and not a member of the First Presidency, she said, "Go away. I don't want you to bless me. You're the last person I want to bless me." At that point, her request for blessings ended. Unfortunately, Kimball's journals for that period do not exist. I didn't get a chance to check on Emmeline's, but I'm going to check it out and see if they have anything to say about it. I learned some things in these diaries. I learned a lot of things in these diaries about a lot of things. Leonard emerges as a more complex and complicated person than I had once thought. He was not just a farm boy from Idaho. He was a more complicated person than that. He wasn't a perfect person, and you can find that in the diaries as well. He wasn't a perfect person, as Gary said, personally or professionally, and he admits some of the costs that his workaholism engendered. He was reflective. He could be compassionate. I've seen that in person. But he also was very strategic about things, and at times pretty honest about that approach. I really enjoyed his assessment of what he said, the two different types of church bureaucrats. He said there are those whose primary purpose is to do the will of the brethren. And he said, on the other hand, there are those whose primary purpose it is to do what their own experience and judgment and inspiration tells them is best for the kingdom. I would say that's true in all the bureaucracies that I've known, not just the LDS Church. Anyway, it allowed me to see what was happening at the historical department in a different lens than the one I had when I was there. At once, the story is familiar, at once it's different, but it's always revealing. So finally, this is clearly an important volume. So let me end by paraphrasing Sam Spade from The Maltese Falcon, who was paraphrasing Shakespeare's Prospero in Act 4 of The Tempest. It is the stuff that history is made of. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming to this session. I loved Leonard Arrington's diaries. I admit that I was shocked when I got the PDFs and they were as big as they were, realizing that they weren't spanning his entire life, but they're absolutely worth reading. From 1956 to 1957, Leonard J. Arrington was awarded a fellowship at the Huntington Library in Southern California. While at the Huntington, he had the opportunity to interact with historians who frequented the library for its rich archive and scholarly community. During this time at the Huntington, he recalled meeting with Alan Nevins, a historian of the Civil War. He expressed his admiration for his work and breadth of knowledge. In response, Arrington stated, "I don't know any history, but Utah history." For historians of Utah, and those who are familiar with its past, this statement reflects a vast range of knowledge, because Utah history is a microcosm of American history, and within its borders is the history of a peculiar people. Utah history is a record of the Restoration, colonialism, suffrage, the construction of whiteness, and the formation of the American family. It is the history of meaning-making, identity formation, and the establishment of a theocratic government. When Arrington stated that he only knew Utah history, he inadvertently professed both his humility and range of knowledge, both of which made him one of the greatest historians of the 20th century. Arrington's diaries reveal two central aspects of his method for the writing of history and the work of historiography, infusing the temporal with the spiritual to tell the story of an enchanted world and presenting a warts-and-all approach to his subjects. More than ever before, Arrington articulated the importance of history within the devotional world of Mormonism. He explained, quote, "A discussion of Latter-day Saint doctrine misses something unless the history is included, for the history gives power and significance to the doctrine, to our claims, to our lives. Our history must somehow reflect or reveal the historical character of our faith." For Arrington, Mormonism was a faith grounded in the historical record. From the heavenly witness on the burnt-over ground of upstate New York to the unearthing of plates that sacralized the American landscape, the story of Mormonism collapsed the division between the sacred and the secular. History was simply the method of telling these stories. Arrington took the faith of his subjects seriously and readily included the presence of the divine in the historical record. This reflects current theoretical directions in the study of religious history. In the words of Robert Orsi, "The study of religion is or ought to be the study of what human beings do to, for, and against the gods really present, and what the gods really present do for, with, to, and against humans." In many ways, Arrington's early interest in finding a meaning of combining the historical record with faith was methodologically ahead of its time. But Arrington's focus on weaving the sacred into the historical of the church did not mean excluding the messy or complicated parts. Arrington's methods involved a treatment of absence. In the words of Arrington, this included a more open archive and a warts-and-all approach to a telling of the past. Within this methodology, Brigham Young was no longer a one-dimensional prophet, but also a man who chewed tobacco and had imperfect sons. Speaking to Elder Stapley on the problem of including these aspects that may, quote, reflect poorly on the church, he wrote, "I replied that if our picture is entirely rosy, nobody, even members of the church, will have confidence in what we write, because members of the church know that there are warts and blemishes, and unless we acknowledge these, they will not have confidence in what we were writing and that the whole truth is being presented." His reply was again, "We must leave the bad things out of our history." Arrington disagreed. The ability to write in this manner came from Arrington's desire for a more open archive and wider access. Of course, this was met with opposition from church leaders who recognized the dangers of an open archive. Dangerous because open archives free the people from the past to be their actual selves, void of the historical distance that makes them safe. The saints are no longer mere reflections of perfection, but struggling humans reaching out toward their God as they toil to build Zion. Arrington wanted a history of real people, and he did just that. He created a history of real people that offers historical figures the same thing we all want: fairness in the midst of our flaws. One of the things I appreciate most about the Diaries of Leonard Arrington is that, much like his historical writing, Arrington's diaries present a warts-and-all approach to himself. Like his characters, he was not one-dimensional. While he hired women and fought to keep women employed during the duration of their pregnancy, something the church did not do previously, he also spoke of his struggles, his anger, his illness, and his flaws. I would be remiss if I did not mention my own visceral reaction to his quick remarriage and his often flippant comments about liberals toward the end of his life. But that's what good history does. It offers truthful accounts, even when it's hard, and something we don't really want to do. Mormon history is about uncovering meaning and constructing narratives of the past that are infused with the power of the divine. It's also about uncovering the past in an attempt to better understand the present and the future. On August 29, 1986, Arrington wrote, "On the one hand, history is on our side. Let the consequences follow. On the other hand, it is only on our side as long as we can control the historians." History has consequences. It is also a force of vindication. For the struggling, the marginalized, those subjected to the Church Inquisition, as Arrington called it, of 1983, the men who participated in the Revelation of 1886, which was later buried, and those who felt the blunt force of church leadership in the form of excommunication during the beginnings of the new era of Mormon studies. In life, Arrington knew this. It is my belief that in death, these diaries will be part of the vindicating force of history. Thank you.
God moves in mysterious ways, but I think I've got him figured out on one count at least, that he's placed Jed Rogers on this earth in part to make sure that I don't sink into a life of idleness. So on the outside chance that I ever make it to heaven, I'm going to owe it partly to Jed Rogers. I remember when my wife and I walked out of Benchmark Books with our copy of the Arrington Diaries. We were going down the stairs and she said something like, "Well, I'll see you at the end of summer." She hasn't left me yet. She's sitting right here, so thank God Leonard Arrington didn't produce a divorce anyway. It's been a wonderful experience reading those diaries, and although Jed hijacked my reading list for the entire summer, it's been a wonderful experience. And I didn't know Leonard Arrington well at all. There are many people here who knew him much better than I did, but I think you would have had to have known Leonard Arrington very intimately, not to have gotten to know him better from reading these diaries. There's a lot of really personal stuff in there that I don't think you would have divulged to just anyone. And in fact, having been through the rest of his papers, these diaries are the most intimate look that you are ever going to get at Leonard Arrington. I feel like I know more about him, much more about him, know him much better than I did before I started this. As I read the diaries, I found myself just kind of flashing back over history at the other great diaries in Western civilization. And I thought about the diaries of Samuel Pepys, recording all the ins and outs on the waterfronts and the drawing rooms of Stuart, England in the 1660s. And I thought about the diaries of Saint-Simon at the same time, over across the channel, chronicling all the hanky-panky going on in the court of Louis XIV. And then I moved up toward the present. I thought about the few Mormon diaries that I am familiar with, the diary of Hosea Stout, the diary of John D. Lee. Leonard Arrington's diaries can stand with those toe to toe. They are that good and that revealing. And a large part of that, I think, is just because of their volume. Samuel Pepys and Saint-Simon had to scratch out their diaries with quill pens, and Hosea Stout and John D. Lee were scratching them out with an inkwell and an old steel pen. Leonard Arrington dictated his diaries and then put his secretary to work on them and transcribed them using a typewriter. So he could get much more detail, much more volume into his diaries just because of the advances of technology in the 20th century. And so they are just great diaries. The other kind of preliminary comment I'd like to make is to thank Gary Bergera for doing just an incredible job of editing those diaries. I am just absolutely in awe of the job that you did. I thought as I went through them, what if I had tried to do this? I would have been completely hung up after about 10 pages. It just took so much knowledge, not only of Mormon history, but of Mormon folkways and institutions and theology that I just don't have at all. And the research that he did into some incredibly obscure people that I never had heard of and will never hear of again, I'm sure. But he researched them out, and I'm speaking to you here as a footnote junkie too. I love the footnotes as much as the text, and he just did an incredible job. And if he doesn't walk out of here with some big award after the annual meeting next year, I'm going to terminate my entire affiliation with the Historical Society. Okay, what I think I can offer uniquely here to this session is this. Jed told us that he conceived of this session today partly as kind of a follow-up on a similar session we had last year at the annual meeting, in which several people, including Gary Bergera, dissected my book, Utah Historians and the Reconstruction of Western History. So I thought I would kind of follow up on that. For those of you who have not read that book, and it probably includes the vast majority of you, it's sold very, very poorly. It's a study of some 5 historians, Western historians, all with roots in Utah. And what I did was I started out with a brief biographical sketch of some maybe 20, 30 pages, something like that, and then followed those up with several brief essays exploring what I regarded as interpretive problems with that historian. When I first wrote that book, I had intended that there would be a section on Leonard Arrington in that book. But the Arrington papers were not open to research at the time, and so I wanted to go ahead with the book anyway, so I just released it anyway without having consulted the Arrington papers. And I made a few regrettable kind of perfunctory comments about Leonard Arrington and the New Mormon history at the end, which I'd like to erase now since I've gone beyond that. After a time, once the Arrington papers became open to research, I approached Chuck Rankin at the University of Oklahoma Press about the possibility of issuing a revised and expanded edition of my Utah Historians book, which would include that section on Leonard Arrington that I had not included in the first edition. And to my immense surprise, he came back and said, well, I have a better idea. Why don't you write a biography of Leonard Arrington? Bowled me over. I had never intended to do that, but I couldn't pass that up. So I negotiated a sabbatical from my teaching responsibilities, a sabbatical I had not earned and did not deserve, but was able to big deal myself into it anyway by a compliant dean that I had. And so I took a year off and wrote a little biography of Leonard Arrington. My Leonard Arrington biography, I never intended to be anything approaching definitive, and it certainly isn't. It's just kind of an expanded version of the sections that on the other historians that I had included in my original book. When I wrote that book, the Leonard Arrington diaries were not available to research. I did not seek and was not granted a dispensation to use the Arrington diaries, so I wrote my book without access to those diaries. So as I went through Gary's edition of the Arrington diaries, I kept asking myself, so if I had had these when I wrote my Arrington book, what would I have written differently? And so here's what I found as I went through them. I ran into Gary, I think, a couple of times while he was working on the diaries, and I asked him, hey, Gary, are there any bombshells in these diaries? And he told me on both occasions, no, there aren't any. And there aren't. There are no bombshells. He didn't have a secret mistress or anything like that. The idea is laughable, in fact. But that's not to say there are no surprises in the diaries. And one of the things that surprised the daylights out of me was his ability to create brief, concise evaluations of people's personalities and their contributions. And the very first one that comes out is one that John mentioned, and this happens, I think, within the first 100 pages of Volume 1, his appraisal of David O. Mckay. And he presents the good part and the bad part and everything in between over a scope of, I think, fewer than 2 pages. And I read that and I thought, my goodness, this is incredible. I didn't think Leonard had the ability to analyze human personality this way. And as you go through the diaries, this happens again and again and again. Joseph Fielding Smith, Spencer W. Kimball, Delbert L. Stapley, and to my great surprise, even Ernest L. Wilkinson, whom I come to regard as one of the villains of Utah history. He has this wonderful positive evaluation of Ernest L. Wilkinson. And so as I read the diaries, then I kept asking myself, so why in the world didn't he get this stuff into his books? His books, in my opinion, as the other historians' books that I have critiqued, the one shortcoming they have is kind of in-depth personal analysis. He doesn't get very far under their skins. Why didn't he do that? Well, the answer became slowly apparent to me as I read the rest of the diaries and realized that he and the other people in the history division were just being dogged by people like Marquis Peterson, Ezra Taft Benson, Boyd K. Packer, and they just demanded that every comma in those books be faith-promoting somehow. And it's just a wonder that they got as much good work written as they did, and they did a very impressive job. But the way those guys were hounded, and especially then even by G. Homer Durham, who becomes the real villain in Arrington's diaries, the friend that he thought he had, who would defend him against these attackers, turned out to be one of the leading attackers and was leading the charge in dismantling the history division. So I thought that Tom Alexander really hits the nail on the head in his afterword at the end of Volume 3 when he talks about reading Great Basin Kingdom when he was a college student. And he read that and he said, you know, this guy doesn't have to bear his testimony on every page. What we have here is obviously a person who appreciates the Mormon contribution to Western history and just celebrates it. And so if Arrington's attackers could simply have been satisfied with that, I think the history division would have had a longer and even more successful history than it did. So that's my 2 bits worth.
As I made my way through these diaries, it became very clear that I wouldn't have an opportunity to critically evaluate Gary Bergera's excellent editing on this project. It became clear that what I was really evaluating was Leonard Arrington himself. And so I appreciate all of the comments that have been offered. I'm just going to offer a few of my own and then open it up so we can comment on what each other has said and then a few other questions. Rather cynically, I've perhaps often wondered why Arrington has loomed so large in our memory. And I recognize that, I guess cynically I was thinking that historians like to lionize their own. But clearly I recognize that through these diaries, Arrington was a force, an individual I never knew, had the honor to meet or know firsthand, but I feel like I have this vivid sort of mental portrait of who he was and the times in which he operated. Clearly see from the diary is the mind and workings of a highly ambitious, self-conscious individual, one who from youth aimed for great things. And what we have in these diaries are the reflections, I think, of a scholar who is clearly at the height of his historian powers, but also reaching the end of his productive years, and who it seems increasingly became nostalgic for his lived life and missed opportunities. And no more evident, I think, when he lamented not having gone into law or politics. So the transition to BYU in the early 1980s left Arrington in a reflective mood. He questioned his life's path and legacy, at least in this diary entry that I'm referring to. On the one hand, he felt sure he'd be remembered as this giant in Mormon history. On the other, he felt frustration and wistfulness. I would have been more appreciated as a lawyer and public official, he wrote dejectedly. So what I'm struck by these diaries is the fact that how many times he reflects back on his early life. And I know we tend to compartmentalize people's lives. I tend to think of Arrington's pre-1972 life and then his post-1972, and in a way these diaries kind of offer that compartmentalization. Let me just offer a few comments on that. So Arrington often takes readers back to his early years, right? So he provides details into his early influences and achievements, as when he outlines the prodigious scholarly output in 1951 and 52. It's fascinating. Just so happens that in 1951, I believe, he first publishes an article in the Utah Historical Quarterly. So prior to becoming church historian, he publishes, by my count, it may be wrong, 27 articles in the Utah Historical Quarterly. He authored or co-authored 27 articles. And these, along with many others, he wrote for publications like in Arizona in the West, Idaho Yesterdays, Montana, the Magazine of Western History, Western Humanities Review, Proceedings of the Utah Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Letters, and others fit, in my mind, more comfortably under the rubric of Western or regional history than Mormon history. Consider, too, that he helped found the Western Historical Quarterly and served as its first editor. Of course, the worlds of Western, Utah, and Mormon history overlap a great deal, right? So the Utah State Historical Society's earliest directors and board members were LDS, contributing to a particular ideological bent, but the Utah Historical Quarterly was never predominantly a Mormon publication. It was rather broadly conceived, at least prior to the 1960s, as a journal of regional history. And before the founding of the Mormon History Association's Journal of Mormon History in 1965, and the Western Historical Association's Western Historical Quarterly in 1969, regional and some national scholars published in the quarterly, and a wide range of readers consumed its pages. The founding of other history-related publications, primarily in the 1960s, served to more precisely funnel the interests of the specialists. So the immediate needs of each group were met through more narrowly defined organizations and their publications. The result was that, at least in the case of the Utah Historical Quarterly, at least this is my reading, that at the same time it became more professional and scholarly, it also began to constrict as the discipline became cast into silos. There are a lot of implications in what I'm saying here, but I mention it because Arrington's diary gives us a sense, I think, for how some of these categories and divisions played out. By that it seems to me that Arrington was the principal force in fashioning Mormon history as a distinct field of study, and in his personality and prodigious output, he was its leading practitioner. So he's now remembered principally by his work, post-1972, as a Mormon historian. And I say this knowing full well that, of course, his most recognized book was published in 1958, and that so I know that the story here is much more complicated than I represent it, but I'm struck by, in these diaries, just how much Arrington identified, at least after 1972, as a quote-unquote Mormon historian, and less as I always understood him to be, as a Western regional historian. But of course, as I say, the story is complicated, and he was operating in both worlds simultaneously. So, in a sense, the diaries shift focus from Arrington to the larger project of history making in the 1970s and 1980s. It's as though Arrington is the receptor of the history community, and he records the going-ons in great detail. It's tempting to see the attention to personalities, projects, and episodes as gossip, as John mentioned, and it's probably not wrong to so conclude, but my sense is that Arrington in these diaries can't help to do what historians do, to inquire, research, analyze, write. My reading is also that Arrington reveled in being at the center. By force of his personality and position, people gravitated to him. In fact, I think this has been mentioned, but individuals would come to Arrington on a regular basis, and Arrington would record these conversations in great detail. And not just that, but he would also record in great detail conversations that he heard secondhand. So, I don't know of a record of the historical profession in the 1970s and 1980s in Salt Lake City, or dealing with Mormon history or Utah history, more illuminating than this one. Like all diaries, this is a mediated record, perhaps more so here, clearly, since Arrington is writing for an audience. Entries are almost mini essays, carefully and self-consciously crafted and positioned. The diaries also offer an introspective window into the thinking of Arrington the man, who exhibited a penchant for reflection, self-awareness, memory, humor. So, Yeah, just a couple of observations. I want to turn it over now to the rest of the panel to just provide an opportunity for the four of you to offer comment on what's been said so far, and then I have a few questions before we'll open it up to the larger audience. Is there anything that, broad question I should probably never ask, but is there anything that's been said that you want to respond to? Either of the four of you can begin. No? Okay. Yeah, let's move this over there.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
For the FBI.
Speak directly. Yeah.
one of the angles that I think that we need to explore is what the diaries reveal about the process and enterprise of Utah and Mormon history. By that I mean, how is history made? Like, how did the Arrington factory work, right? Some of you may have operated under the Arrington factory. Clearly it worked out. I mean, so there's this one entry where Truman Madsen has read the Mormon Experience, and he indicates that this collaborative project with Dave Spitton seemed to have struck just the right tone and the right amount of candor and introduced new ideas and interpretations. Quote, he thought our collaboration was just great. G. Homer Durham at one point commenting on the Mormon Experience said he could clearly pick out those essays or chapters that had a warm style, and those were Arrington's, and the cold scholarly style came from Bitten. So, I think it's interesting, so we can comment on sort of how the process, what we might learn from the process of doing history, and of course the pitfalls for that as well. The pitfalls dealing with a church bureaucracy that oftentimes didn't value the historical record the way that Arrington insisted. Although I will say that Arrington, at one point in the diary, indicates that that there were episodes or historical facts, quote unquote facts, that were worth not publishing. I don't know if you recall that entry or not, but in any case, I wanted to open it up to the rest of you, talking about the Arrington factory, sort of how he and what we might learn from the historical enterprise from this diary. Any comments?
Don't everybody
I'll
speak.
start with something, and if this doesn't answer the question that you're asking, maybe somebody else can. So, it's telling to me that Arrington's grave in Logan has, in addition to his name and birth and death dates, it also says beloved mentor. That's how either he or his family identified himself. I think that one of Arrington's most famous essays, too, was published in BYU Studies, and is called Historian as Entrepreneur. I suspect that as proud as Arrington may have been of his historical publications, he saw his greatest achievement, and maybe his longest lasting accomplishment, is mentoring other people. If you wrote anything in history and it was published while Arrington was alive, you probably got a thank you note from him. I never have experienced that with other people, and Arrington was aware of what was going on. He was incredibly encouraging, and it was hard not to write without thinking that Arrington was going to be a reader, and that you might hear something from him, and if you heard something from him, it was going to be encouraging. I also think that, and at last year's discussion about the work of Gary Topping, I talked about Arrington, and one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because Gary does a really good job of this, there's an impression that Arrington could be a plagiarist, in that he would take other people's work, he would assign other people to write things, and then he would put his name on them. he might tweak them a little bit, but then he would put his name on them either as the primary author or as a co-author. And Gary deals with this in his standalone biography of Arrington. And one of the things that struck me in working on the Arrington Diaries is that Arrington is very, very open about the way that he approaches this, the Arrington factory or the Arrington machine. And he would identify in his diary, there are entries where he would say, okay, these chapters in this book, this biography of Brigham Young, or the Mormon Experience were written, the first drafts were written by these people. And then we, either I and Davis Bitton would go through them and we would do our own thing to it. And he's very open about that. He's not trying to hide anything. This is just the way that he learned how to write, how he learned how to do history. And maybe I could ask Gary now about that. Did you find anything that you didn't know about? Was there any surprises to you in the way that he approached using other people to write kind of a group history? And he also comments on the fact that they decided early on that his name as the church historian would give credence, whether it's fair or not, to the work of other people. And that is sometimes why his name would be attached to other people's work.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that I found about Leonard Arrington, and one of the things that put me off about him when I started studying these historians, was this Arrington factory idea. I really didn't want to write about him. I thought, what am I writing about here, a committee or a person? You know, I can critique the work of a single mind, but I've got a committee here. What is this? But I came around on it, and I became a huge admirer of it. And what I admired about it was that this so-called history factory represented Mormon communitarianism kind of at its best. That these people were willing to submerge their egos into this larger project. And if they didn't get full credit for what they had contributed to a book or something, that's just part of it. You know, they really didn't mind. And as Gary just indicated, he did wonderful things for graduate students who he would invite them to co-author a piece, and they would get sometimes their first publication or two, and therefore get a leg up in their academic career. And there's just one final thing I'd like to mention, the other side of the coin. I can't remember where I read this recently, but it had to do with Ron Walker. That Ron had written something, and that it was entirely his work, and he took it to Arrington, and Arrington liked it, and he said, okay, well, we'll publish this under my name. And Ron said, you know, I don't feel comfortable with that. And Arrington said, okay, we'll publish it under your name. He wasn't about to ride roughshod over somebody's ego. And I knew Ron Walker really well, and I would never accuse him of having an ego. but he did want credit for his own work, and Leonard was totally willing to let him have that.
He gave encouragement to a lot of people. And you didn't have to be a graduate student to get that encouragement. When my late wife was first writing, every so often the phone would ring. Linda, this is Leonard. I just read your poem in The Friend. It's a wonderful poem. Keep up the good work. And that was very validating to my wife. You know, these were okay poems, but they were nothing great. But he took time out of his day to sort of say to her, what you're doing is important. Now, she wrote a few things after that, probably more important. But without that encouragement, maybe she wouldn't have. And so I saw that in many other circumstances, personally, but in other circumstances as well. So I think the fact that it says mentor is a pretty accurate word. I assume it's his family, but I think it's accurate.
I just wanted to comment on the idea of the factory idea of Leonard's work. And one of the things I found really interesting about the Diaries was when that factory system would break down, because it would break down all the time, whether either in favor of the church and its bureaucracy or not in favor of the church. And so you mentioned how even Leonard had things he didn't really want released from the archive. And so like there were so many times where with the story of the Latter-day Saints, the church, the bureaucracy of the church came out and said, we don't like this. And you can't buy the story of the Latter-day Saints anymore, really. It's really hard to find a copy. I was just able to find one at Weller, but they're hard to find. The Sesquicentennial series got shut down, and so there's these moments where the factory system that he created of making history didn't work. And then on the other hand, if you close archives, that doesn't work. Like, you can't, like, people are going to get things. And so one of the examples that Leonard gives is Fred Collier, and how Fred Collier would just go in and steal them. Just steal things from the archive all the time. And Fred had a really interesting way of doing it, that he would send his wives in, and they would, like, stuff the archives in their bras, or stuff the things in their bras, and leave. And a few months ago, I actually sat down with Fred and a few of his followers, and I asked him, I was like, I was reading the diaries, and you kind of broke down this system that Leonard had. And he just looked at me and he was like, yeah, I did that. And he's proud of it. He remains proud of it. And
Well,
followers do too.
Maybe, so there was a time when Arrington laments that, we seem to be going through a period of anti-intellectualism. And so I was wondering what you all gathered about how history operated in the public sphere, or what the diaries reveal about how history was operating in the public sphere. And by that I mean, there's clearly a lot of instances in the diary where history was they were trying to sort of shove it into a little box, right, and keep it out of the public's eye. It's clearly the case with Story of the Latter-day Saints. On the other hand, I am absolutely struck by how many books folks in his, not numbers of books that they published, but how many copies. We're happy if we sell 1,000 books, right, of a monograph. I mean, they were coming out with thousands of books that they would publish in a print run, and more than that, perhaps, how much money? $20,000 for each of the 16 sesquicentennial history writers, right? I mean, that's good money today, right?
Yeah,
so if
good
you're
money,
offered
yeah.
that for a monograph. But also, like, the ill-fated Friends of Church History had an overflow attendance when they tried to get that off the ground. And then the first lecture of the B.H. Roberts Society, 400 people, according to Arrington, attended. I mean, these are really big numbers. And it's almost like, on the one hand you have this trying to put history in a box and trying to shut it down, but on the other hand there's this thirst for history in the public sphere. So I'm wondering if any of you caught into that, and if there's anything to say more about it.
So I went first last time, so it's...
Somebody else.
Well, I would just say if I could sell 1,000 copies of anything, I'd feel like I'd died and gone to heaven.
100 sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me. I think there was this great hunger for a more honest Mormon history at the time, and Leonard felt that. He understood that. That's part of the reason why he kept this diary to begin with. He was conscious of the fact that he was heading up a really new thing and a really good thing. And I've just been baffled all the way through the diaries to see the headwind and the currents that they had to row against in order to get that out. The Story of the Latter-day Saints is a heck of a good book. It's got a pro-Mormon bias to it. What would you expect? Glenn and Jem are both practicing Mormons. What do you expect, But it doesn't present a dishonest view of Mormon history, and the idea that they would get that kind of resistance is just was baffling to me.
Well, there was a lot of tension there during the brief period of time that I was there. Tension on releasing materials and why are you doing this kind of tension, and the existence of those spies in the department who were constantly funneling everything over to 47 East. But one thing I think it's important to remember is there were 3 divisions in the historical department. And the history division is probably the best known. But the history division was not the division charged with making available the materials. And there were times, Jeff backed me up on this, there were times when the history division clearly didn't want those materials to be made available. Leonard did not want anybody to have much access to the recently cataloged Brigham Young materials until he was finished with his biography. So there was tension and there was tension. I don't know that he really mentions that, particularly in the diaries, but I think understanding I don't know how to say this. Well, like you said just a minute ago, Jeff, Friends of Church History was an amazing meeting and an amazing success, and was shut down just like that because it couldn't be controlled. It was a hell of a time. I wished I had taken better notes because it was a hell of a time.
John touches on something that I just want to mention, and that is that Arrington sometimes gets credit for things that he was not responsible for, and the opening of the church archives is one of those things. Arrington did not have authority over the archives, and it's interesting, and actually the opening of the archives occurred before Arrington's appointment as church historian. Yet it started to occur under Joseph Fielding Smith, and especially under Howard W. Hunter, and the archives was really open for a period of time. It was amazingly open. Even today, as open as the church archives, the church library is today, during the last year or months of Joseph Fielding Smith and throughout Howard W. Hunter's brief tenure as the church historian, it was very, very open.
I would just say that people want their history, and one of the things that's interesting that Leonard Arrington briefly touches on, and in the footnotes it's kind of mentioned, is at the same time during Leonard Arrington's tenure as church historian, that was also the heyday of the Mormon Underground, where and I don't know if a lot of people probably remember them, where non-LDS Mormons went into the archive and they would take things and they would publish them in underground newspapers. And Robert Ray Black was really big on this. He's a prophet still. And so there was this parallel situation going on where Leonard Arrington was running this very kind of correlated openness, but at the same time there was a public way of doing history that was very underground, but it was even more open. And so I think it's interesting that if you read those histories, if you read Leonard Arrington's history alongside this history of this underground way of doing public history, there's a really interesting juxtaposition there.
Okay, thank you. So we have over 10 minutes. Let's go ahead and open it up. Any questions for our panel? Ron?
I don't think I have a question. I'm just sort of saying, well, it's clear to me that I think one of Leonard's reasons for the factory was to encourage young scholars. And I got acquainted with Leonard before that, but mainly on an airplane going to the American Historical Association meeting. He found out what I was doing. I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, and found out what I was doing. About a month later, he called me up and said, "Hey, I'm working on this book. I want to find out what Eccles did. What was Scott unlike at this period of time?" So I did some research and wrote him up something, sent it off to him. About a month after that, he called me up and said, "Ron, I'm doing some research on. I'm writing a book on Charles C. Rich. Would you write something for me?" Well, and he said, "I'll pay you. You can either come." By that time, it was church historian. Either come here or else you can go to Logan. My in-laws lived in Logan, so we went to Logan. He had all the research and all the files. All I did was sit down and write a couple of chapters for him. As it turned out, I thought he'd go through and really change those words in those chapters. They're really my chapters, but under his name. He did give me credit for it in his story. I got paid for it.
He did have the struck by his, of course, his output was just tremendous, but I just felt like he had this impulse to get his material out into the world. One thing he criticized George Ellsworth, his old friend at USU, is just George Ellsworth could do everything better than the rest of us. He could teach better, he could probably write better, research better, but it just took too long to do it. Arrington was just a doer. So.
Let me take this from profound to the less profound for a minute. About your comments about him mentoring. I will remember Leonard very well. I grew up about a block from where he and Grace lived in Logan, and they were close friends of my parents. And when I started at Utah State as an undergraduate, I came to study political economy as my major area of focus. But I remember going down the hall to the history department, stopping into Leonard's office, and he would talk to me as an undergraduate in college about the value of history, and I really kind of learned what history was, and that's what moved me into kind of an avocational interest. So I think with many undergraduates, because I had a couple of friends who also were treated wonderfully by Leonard just on an informal basis. People would go and visit him in his office, and many of us became avocational historians, and quite strong ones, because of what Leonard said, even though we may have been studying something else. And I remember he even introduced me to Juanita Brooks, and I got a chance to talk with her, and I remember a dinner at my parents' place where Juanita Brooks and Leonard and Grace were both there, and his influence, I think, through both my life, but also through a number of other young undergraduates at Utah State in the late 60s, was quite strong, even though none of us ended up, my wife actually worked for Leonard when he started the Western Historical Quarterly and was one of his secretaries for a while. And the personal relationship as a mentor, I think, was very strong, and I think you'll find there's a number of students of that era, before he moved into the controversial aspects of working with the church, became very close to him, and he influenced a lot of people very strongly in that late 60s, early 70s era. So I just thought I would share that. I'm not generally a person who reads diaries, but your comments are making me want to read the diaries.
Just a little bit of trivia on that. You mentioned Juanita Brooks. One of the funniest things in his diary records a meeting he had with Juanita Brooks right after he became church historian, and she was kind of angling for a job that maybe she'd like to work for him, and he says, no, she's just too old and set in her ways. And Juanita Brooks would have been a handful. That would have been a huge mistake if he had ever hired her. I want to get these young master's degree students that are kind of malleable, you know.
Well, she was quite elderly.
Yeah.
I met her, and this would have been a number of years after that as well.
Yeah.
Jed, I have a question. I have a couple of questions for you.
For me,
Yeah, for you. Is that okay?
depends on the question.
Really? So, what was there anything in the diaries that was really kind of surprising for you?
I mean, every page was surprising in a way. Honestly, this has been said before. I mean, maybe not every page. His travel accounts got tiresome a bit. So there are sections where I would I'd skim through, but I had no idea what I knew that Arrington would have some interesting stuff in there, but the diary is way more detailed, insightful, gossipy, and reflective than I ever imagined most diaries to be. So I've edited the diary of Leonard J. Nuttall, basically, and he just wrote things matter-of-factly, fairly succinctly, and you don't get a whole lot of insight into the person or his inner thoughts. It's not the case, I think, with these Arrington diaries, which is one thing that makes them quite unique. So, I was really captivated by them. And any good diary will captivate you because you start to see this larger, more vivid portrait. But most of the time, page after page, I wouldn't normally go through a diary just like endlessly, just reading every word. But I think this is one that you could do that because it really is that surprising. I can't give you any details though. We could. Yeah, there are lots of really funny things in there.
I'll tell you, one of the things about the diaries that impressed me was this very frankness you're talking about. There's a letter in his papers. This isn't in the diary, but in his papers from his son Carl, at about the time things really started to unravel at the history division. And Carl says, "Why don't you call these guys out? Call them what they are. So tell them what G. Homer Durham is, what Joseph Anderson is, and just stand up, And there's no response from Leonard. But later on, then he said, this just isn't my style. I don't deal with people that way. But he did call them out in his diary. He wouldn't do it publicly, but he I remember when he was dealing with the manager of Deseret Book at one point about the Sesquicentennial series, and this guy says something about, we're not going to rush to get these out because the Sesquicentennial is already over and all that. And Leonard says, that's BS. And probably the strongest language he ever used. That's BS. We never intended for these things to appear in 1980 anyway, so anyway. Frankness.
Jeff, you had a question. I want to make sure we catch you.
Well, I guess it's a comment. I just wanted to appreciate what Gary said about the archives. I was there before Leonard came, and we were excited when he came, though Elder Hunter was good to work with. But we also had a different goal. The archivist's goal was to prepare the material for the researchers to use it. And we were working very hard to do that. The history division's goal was to write Mormon history. Well, we got along and often worked together to help them in what they were writing. We felt our goal was to provide and help people who were coming in writing Mormon history. So I just appreciate the idea that the archivists were working very hard before Leonard came to make the material available, and it was important for us to provide the material to everybody, not just people who were in the history division. No, they were wonderful colleagues. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thanks for those. That's interesting. Go ahead.
This is tangential, but gives a real interesting light on G. Homer Durham. The year that Leonard became church historian, Joe Bishop became president at Weber State. And after a couple of years, it was quite evident that this was not the correct decision. I was elected chair of the Faculty Senate, and in 1977 came to Salt Lake to talk with George Hatch, who owned KUTV and other kinds of things, and was the chair of the Board of Regents and the Commissioner of Church Education. The Commissioner of the Board of Regents, the Commissioner of Education, G. Homer Durham, who was a political scientist, John Witzow's son-in-law, and had been president of Arizona State. And we explained how intolerable Joe Bishop was as president of Weber State. And G. Homer Durham said, you faculty members go home and go to the archives and read Chaucer. Things will be taken care of, but you be patient. And of course, he then became a general authority and was a company man as well in dealing with Leonard Arrington and these kinds of things. He had forgotten what it was like to be an academic as he dealt with Arrington, as he had forgotten what it was like to be a faculty member.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, I can take one more question if there is one. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Yes, Ken.
With regards to process with the diaries, I was interested that mentioned that he dictated these diaries. Did he ever go back and edit those, add to them, or was it set in stone when he dictated into the recorder?
So the original diaries for this period of time, you can see his hand. He would dictate. His secretary would type them up. Then he would go through and hand correct. And so you can see some have extensive hand corrections, others don't. And that seemed to be the way that he handled things up until the move from Salt Lake to Provo. He didn't have quite the same support, secretarial support in Provo. He he didn't like Provo, and so he didn't spend a lot of time in Provo. He would just go down when he would have to teach, and that was basically it. And so he was left at home, and he would do his own typing at home. Once in a while, there might be a handwritten, but it's mostly him after 1982 with his own typewriter, and then he would do the same thing. He would type and would then go through. I don't know how much time would lapse between dictation, typing, and correction. And what I tried to do with the diaries is the diaries aren't a facsimile reproduction of the originals. I made all the changes that Arrington made, so it's a clean. I accepted that this published version was going to be Arrington's preferred version. That's kind of what I tried to do with those.
Okay, well that concludes. Thanks to everyone.